Sometimes people think I'm dead or injured or drunk until they see the camera and the flower or the flash going off. I guess I'm always trying to find the perfect picture. I'm looking for the right light, the right location, and the right pansy. I plant pansies at the site of homophobia. I take a photograph, I name it after the abuse, and then I post it on my website, thepansyproject.com. The Pansy Project started when on one day I experienced 3 separate incidences of homophobia on the street. These weren't new experiences, but the shock of 3 attacks in one day drove me to do something about it. At the time, I was doing an MA in fine art, and I was just beginning to explore making work directly on the street. What I realized was that when I walked past these locations, I would remember the abuse, and it would upset and anger me. People around me couldn't believe that this still happened. So I felt there was a need to create something to draw attention to the fact that it still did. I wanted to alter the way I felt when I walked past these locations. I was interested in how floral memorials change the way you read a street. You know that something has happened there simply by seeing a pile of dying flowers. Flowers were the thing. It took me a while to come up with the exact flower, but eventually I settled on the pansy because of its obvious connections with homophobia. I planted them where I experienced the attacks, and immediately the act of kneeling and planting and documenting felt like a ritual. Planting changed the locations. They were no longer just places where I had experienced abuse. They became locations where I had planted pansies. I'd transformed the way I thought about these places. I'd reclaimed the memory of these streets. I began by marking my own experience of homophobic abuse. But since 2005, I've been traveling and planting them for others. I've planted hundreds of pansies all over the world, and I do have my favourite photographs. Though this one I planted in Blackpool is probably still the favourite. Everything is aligned: the light, the pansy and the location. The fact that you can see Blackpool Tower in the background identifies the location and helps tell the story of the planting. In the image, the flower is as big as the tower. It sums up the mission of the Pansy Project to combat homophobia with a tiny little plant, though in this picture, it looks iconic. I'm aware of the absurdity of trying to fight such a complex issue with a flower, though there's joy and beauty in this act of reclaiming these locations of violence. And I never forget that every planting marks abuse, some of it horrifying. In 2009, I planted a pansy for Michael Causa. He'd been beaten up and tortured and had his body dumped on the street in Liverpool. He died 2 weeks later as a result of his injuries. It was a terrible case, and because I'd planted pansies in Liverpool already, I was contacted and asked to come and plant a pansy. But I needed to wait. I needed to give the family time to process what had happened. So a year later, I went back to Liverpool and met Michael's parents, and we planted the pansy together. It was overwhelmingly sad, and I continue to talk about it because it remains the most tragic pansy I've ever planted. And it was at that point that I realised the Pansy Project has the capacity to be more profound than I could ever have thought. Alongside the plantings, I've also explored the project in a number of different ways. I collaborated with my brother Tom to create the Pansy Project garden. I worked with Tatty Divine to make brooches that promoted the project. I collaborated with Bundy and Webster to create sweatshirts and t-shirts. This work creates ambassadors for the project. If someone is wearing a Pansy Project t-shirt, they can share its story. They don't have to, but the fact that they have one means they can. Most recently, I've written and illustrated a children's book called Pansy Boy. I created this book to share the project as a conceptual shield with children. So if and when children experience homophobia, they have this idea planted in their head. It can become a little bit of protection from the embarrassment and shame of bullying. Perhaps they'll think of planting a pansy when they've experienced abuse, rather than question their right to exist in the world. It was essential for me that Pansy Boy was a three-dimensional character. He had to be complex and not just defined by his potential sexuality. He loves drawing and birds and paper aeroplanes, just as I did.
With eyes of green and curls of brown, he was a boy from an average town. He loved to draw and he loved to write. He marvelled at all things in flight. Slightly crestfallen and reluctantly glum, the day arrived that he knew would come. Fairy, pansy, or just queer were the words he came to fear.
I wrote Pansy Boy for my childhood self. I needed to give this little boy some justice. Decades later, there's still a need to show young people that being different is a good thing. This book is for children who are going through now what I did then. I guess I'm an accidental activist because I talk about homophobia and the work that I do. But fundamentally, I'm an artist and I take photographs. I use this concept to discuss something that is an outrage.